Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you a brand new and highly effective way to counter the fried liver attack, helping you reach a winning position in just 9 moves. Recently, I uploaded a video showing how Magnus Carlsen handled this position as black against Gukesh. He began with the move pawn to d5, followed by a mysterious and creative idea, pawn to b5. The game eventually ended in a draw, but it was a fascinating display of strategy. Now, here's the interesting part. Most grandmasters, myself included, usually consider pawn to b5 to be an interesting and aggressive move, but not particularly solid, something best used against an unprepared opponent. However, Magnus has one of the most frustrating traits a human can have. He's almost always right. So, once he played this move, I decided to analyze it in depth to see whether it's actually a good option for you to play. If your opponents are typically rated below Gukesh's level, this variation will probably work very well for you. After you play pawn to b5, most opponents will instinctively capture that pawn. Of course, there are other options too, which we'll cover in a moment. But in the vast majority of games, they'll take it. After all, it looks tempting. They win a pawn and attack your knight, thinking they've gained the upper hand. But here's where you strike back. You recapture the pawn, and with this single move, you achieve 3 things. You defend your knight, you attack the bishop on b5, and you also threaten the pawn on g2. Naturally, most players will feel that the easiest solution is to trade off the bishop first. After doing so, they'll still need to defend the pawn and then castle kingside. That's the typical plan you'll see from most opponents. Now, you continue with bishop to b7, creating a powerful battery along the long diagonal. At first glance, it may seem like a simple and even primitive threat. You're just threatening checkmate in one move, right? It appears that your opponent has plenty of reasonable ways to defend, but here's where things get fascinating. Statistics show that about 85% of opponents will choose the wrong defense, leading them straight into disaster. In this position, there's actually only one move that can save them, and it's completely counterintuitive. Instead of blocking the diagonal, the only correct defense is queen to f3, placing their own queen directly in line with your bishop. For most players, that move just feels wrong, so they rarely play it. And even if they do, the position remains roughly balanced. You can simply push pawn to a4, and the game continues with equal chances. However, since the majority of your opponents will defend incorrectly, they'll fall into trouble almost immediately, giving you a decisive advantage within just a few moves. For instance, if your opponent tries to bring their knight back into play to block the diagonal, they'll often play knight to f3. At first, it might look like white is still a pawn up and doing fine. They seem to be adding pressure to your pawn, but in reality, that threat is quite harmless since your knight can easily move away. Now comes the fun part. You can be absolutely ruthless and continue to insist on your checkmating plan. The key idea is simple. Drive away that knight on f3 so you can deliver checkmate on g2. You do this by pushing pawn to g5. It may look wild. You already sacrificed a pawn earlier with pawn to b5, and now you're pushing another pawn up the board? But here's the paradox. This reckless strategy is shockingly effective. Your plan to push pawn to g4, chase away the knight, and then checkmate on g2 works far more often than you'd think. If white tries to stop your pawn with pawn to h3, that actually helps you, because now you can play rook to g8. On the next move, when you push pawn to g4, your rook will also join the attack, creating massive pressure on the king side. Some players might try to counterattack with rook to e1 or queen to e2, hoping to attack your king or the pawn on a5 along the open file. But that's not a real problem. You simply castle queenside, and surprisingly, your king is perfectly safe. Your bishop on b7 and your pawns form a strong defensive wall, almost like a mirror version of a standard kingside castle. And if your opponent ever gets greedy and captures the pawn on a5 with their knight, that's the end of the game, because you deliver checkmate in 1 with queen takes g2. That's why capturing with the rook isn't a good idea for white either. If they try to take the pawn that way, you simply stick to your original plan. Push pawn to g4 to tear open the g-file. Once white captures, you have a very pleasant choice. You can recapture with either your rook or your knight, and in both cases the attack is completely winning. If you choose to capture with the rook, the pressure on the king side becomes absolutely unbearable for white. For example, if they try something passive like knight to c3, you can even play queen takes f3, because the pawn on g2 is pinned and cannot move. After the resulting exchanges, you'll end up a piece up, having captured the knight on f3 while maintaining a deadly attack. Alternatively, if you prefer, you can recapture with the knight instead. This move gains a tempo by attacking the rook, while also adding yet another piece to your growing offensive, as if you needed any more firepower. After the rook retreats, almost any logical move you make will lead to victory. Your pieces are so active, and white's position is completely suffocated. If you want to get creative, you can even sacrifice your queen in this position. A flashy but totally justified move. It rips open the king's defenses, and after that, you follow up with knight to e3, delivering a discovered check that also covers the f1 square, leaving white completely helpless. Because of that setup, the king has no safe squares left on the back rank. It's forced to move over to the h file, either h1 or h2, but it doesn't really matter. Once that happens, your attack is ready to land the final blow. You deliver a simple yet unstoppable checkmate. After any move they try, rook to h6 seals the game with checkmate. Now, you might wonder what else your opponents can try to stop this deadly attack. The most common defensive attempt is pawn to f3, which looks logical. It aims to block the light squared diagonal, trying to make your bishop on b7 inactive. However, your plan remains exactly the same. You continue with pawn to h6, forcing the knight to move. It can't jump forward, because you'd simply capture it and then recapture with your queen, maintaining both material balance and your checkmating threat. The knight usually retreats, and you keep pushing forward with pawn to g5, the cornerstone of your attack. The idea never changes. Your goal is to push pawn to g4, open the diagonal, and deliver checkmate on g2. If your opponent plays carelessly, the checkmate lands immediately. If not, you simply bring your rook over to the g-file, add even more firepower, and finish the job cleanly. Sometimes white will try to counterattack with queen to e2 or rook to e1, putting pressure on your king or the pawn on a5. But that's nothing to worry about. You just castle queenside, which not only keeps your king perfectly safe, but also activates your rook into the attack. After that, no matter what white does, whether it's pawn to d3 or anything else, your plan stays consistent. You push pawn to g4, open up the diagonal, and launch your final assault. You don't need to memorize every move, just remember the core attacking pattern. Push the pawns on the king side, open lines, and bring all your pieces into the attack. Once you understand that idea, your opponents will struggle to survive beyond a few moves. So white played bishop to c5 check, which is actually a nice idea. They're trying to bring the bishop into the attack. However, white can't block the check with a knight or a bishop, because that would immediately allow queen takes g2 checkmate. Therefore, the king has to move, and then black continues with rook to g8, placing the rook on the open file. Next, we capture the pawn on g4, continuing our attack. White tries knight to c3, but after rook takes g4, we're already threatening queen takes g2, and there are now 3 pieces aimed directly at the king. White attempts knight to e4 to block the diagonal, but black's position is so dominant that there's no need to even capture immediately. Instead, black calmly plays rook to g8, doubling rooks on the file and adding even more pressure. At this point, material doesn't matter. We're fully committed to the attack. Black sacrifices the queen to rip open the defenses, and after knight takes, comes rook takes g2. Now the white king is completely exposed. It's over. If white tries to capture with the queen, then bishop takes follows, and it's checkmate. If they get brave and capture the rook on g8, then rook takes g1 double check ends the game instantly. Thanks for watching.